My name, good evening, everybody. Thank you for being here for this genealogy session. Our meeting is being recorded for the majority of the presentation, and then we will stop recording before any Q&A for folks' privacy. My name is Meg Bacco. I'm the executive director of an organization called Anacostia Trails Heritage Area. We work across Prince George's County on projects ranging from arts, history, culture, and nature. And this year in particular, we've been working on projects and programming related to the semi-quincentennial. And by doing that, by being the convener of some planning meetings, we were able to work really closely with the Prince George's County Genealogical Society, and our organizations have really gotten to know each other. And this is sort of co-presented with the Genealogical Society. So thank you for their members for being here, and for everyone for being here. It's certainly something that I've enjoyed learning a lot about. And the theme for our sort of semi-quincentennial celebrations and commemorations is We the People. So we thought genealogy was a great way for people to either continue their research, start their research, and then also to do that in community and also provide resources. So this is the second of our four-part genealogy series. The first session was last month and is available as a recording. Later this month, we'll have another session related to finding specifically African American ancestors and sort of the resources that would be specific if you have families that were enslaved or enslavers, and then also other records related to African American genealogy. So that will be on February 19th. And then I'll also invite you all to our in-person sort of capstone of this series, which will be on Saturday, March 7th, which is a curated bus tour to many of the genealogical repositories that we have across the county, libraries, historical societies. So we will drop some information in the chat about that event. It is also free, and we're able to do that because of our partnerships and some of the grants that we received specifically for the semi-quincentennial. So thank you for letting me do that brief introduction about why we're all here tonight. One of the collaborations that we're focusing on this year is obviously military history, being that it's the anniversary of the Revolutionary War and things like that. So we are very pleased to be able to bring Craig Scott to this session in particular. Again, thank you to Craig and the Genealogical Society for helping make this happen. I will let Craig introduce himself, and we will just do some tech and make sure that the screen share is working, and then we will start the presentation shortly. Craig, do you want to test your screen share?
Of course. So let's try that. You can see that, so that should be good.
Yes, and if you put it in present mode.
I will as soon as we're ready to go.
Oh, okay.
Because once I do that, I lose access to Zoom,
Okay.
except for people. But I can do that if you want.
How about this? Our team here from the Heritage area will monitor the chat.
Sure.
Um,
Okay.
how would you like to do questions throughout the presentation or at the end?
No, at the end.
Okay, so we'll keep an eye on the chat, folks. Please feel free to write them down either in the chat or on your own notebooks, and then we should have plenty of time for Q&A after Craig's presentation.
You ready?
I think we're ready. Go for it. Thank you so much.
So So you should be able to see that screen. I want to thank both organizations for providing me the opportunity to return to my home county. I was born in Old Sibley, and my parents lived in East Pines, and Wildercroft Elementary School, that's now a police station, was my elementary school. And I lived on a street that ran parallel to the Baltimore Washington Parkway. And in the 50s, according to the Washington Star, my father, as the president of the East Pines Citizens Association, was the individual most responsible for keeping trucks off the Baltimore Washington Parkway, which to this day they still aren't there. And he passed 2 weeks ago at the age of 98. And that's the only reason why I mention him. So, what we're going to do tonight is we're going to have a Revolutionary War case study, but I want to caveat it a little bit by saying that what I want to do tonight is take it cradle to grave for this Revolutionary War soldier, but it's going to be focused on Maryland. But any information that we may deal with Maryland applies to the other colonies. There will be nuances associated with individual colonial law and then state law, but pretty much um, at a high level, everything is pretty much the same. And this methodology that I'm going to teach you tonight will, in fact, work all the way up to World War One, just prior to World War One. And I would say the Mexican Border War, but most people don't even know that we had a Mexican Border War before World War One. So things changed dramatically at that point in time. So we had to do things a little bit differently there. But everything that we learned tonight can basically be applied to all the other wars before that without much difficulty in it. But again, there are nuances because there are more records as we get farther into the century in regards to war. There are just more things available. Um, I have I have 4 talks that I'm currently doing with the Maryland Genealogical Society and Maryland Public Radio that deal with specific wars. I've done one on the Revolution. I did one last night on the War of 1812. My next one is on the Civil War. It's in 2 weeks. And after that, I'm doing one on World War One. So you might look into that so if you're looking for more specific information about specific wars. I'm also doing a what turns out to be a 5 session with David Lambert, uh, 250 celebration for New Hampshire on the Revolution, where I'm doing 3 talks that go into greater detail, of course, using New Hampshire as an example, um, in regards to the Revolution. And I'm also doing one on loyalists, if you have any loyalists uh, there, and you might look to the New Hampshire Genealogical Society to do that. Um, I also have a YouTube channel with over 370 videos on it that deal with all kinds of issues, genealogical, although mainly military because it's my forte. So let's get started. So what we want to do is identify who your possible Revolutionary War ancestors are. Now, one of the things that I've had to deal with over the years is someone will come to me and say, "Who is your Revolutionary War ancestor?" And or I want to join the DAR, help me join the DAR. And I'll say, "Well, who is your ancestor?" And they'll go, "I don't know. I want you to find my ancestor for me so I can join the DAR," which is really interesting when you come right down to it, or the SAR for that. It's happened both ways. You have to have a pedigree chart. You should be doing typical genealogical research before you ever touch military research. You should know the vitals of the person. You should know the narrative about their lives. And now you're just checking to see. In my own instance, my great grandfather was in the 13th U.S. Cavalry and got court-martialed in 1907 for deserting and ended up in a resort in Kansas, I think a place called Leavenworth for a year. And I didn't know that. And nobody in the family said anything about military history. So I urge you all, regardless of what the family folklore is, to go and look for those military ancestors. Now, in regards to the Revolutionary War, pull out your pedigree chart and look for male ancestors born between 1745 and 1765 generally, but you will find people that born as early as 1720, but generally before 1770 who supported the war, and that is also in the catchment population the cohort for something like the DAR because of public service or providing supplies or those kind of things. I haven't, my third great grandfather had a parade thrown for him in 1847 in Posey County, Indiana, as the last surviving Revolutionary War soldier in Posey County, Indiana. He was born in 1771. He was not a Revolutionary War soldier, in spite of what he told everybody, but he was a War of 1812 invalid pensioner. So he could get away with saying, I got my money because I was a Revolutionary War soldier. I don't know whether that's stolen valor or not, because he was wounded at the Battle of New Orleans in 1815, and actually in December of 1814 also. He was wounded twice within 2 weeks. So he was a soldier. It just wasn't in the Revolution. So what do you need to know? You need to know their full name. You need to know their year of birth, their place of birth, because some Revolutionary War muster rolls will tell you that. You want to know where they lived before, because that will determine what kind of unit they will join. In most places, in most colonies, if you're an adult, able-bodied male between the ages of 18 and 55, 65, depending on state law, you're going to be in the militia. The only way to get out of the militia is if a court says that you are basically levy free and you don't have to serve in the militia. So knowing where before is important because nobody in Maryland is going to go to New York to join the militia. Rarely is somebody from Maryland going to go to Massachusetts to join the Continental Line. I'm sure that there are exceptions. I just have never come across any. You want to know where they lived during the conflict because Quakers, especially, move away from the battles. You see an influx of Quakers out of Philadelphia into Maryland and Northern Virginia to get away from the British, to get away from the conflict, period. Loudoun County in Northern Virginia, which isn't far from Prince George's County, is one of the major places that they ended up. And then you want to know where they lived after the conflict because that's where they would have applied for a pension. Most importantly, you want to know the name of the spouse and also the name of at least one child, because if you don't know the child, why are you researching this person anyway? The spouse is important because people have the same name, and you want to be able to do what I call the peso dance, which is where when a Filipina gets married, she's wearing a white dress. At the reception, people pin pesos on her dress, and their money is colored. It's not green. And so it's very beautiful when it's all done, and it's very unique. You want to make your ancestors unique by hanging records on them, just like they do in that peso dance. So the person we're interested in is a guy by the name of Lawrence Huddle. And I know that he was in Maryland before the conflict, and I know he has a spouse named Nancy. I will understand that this is not my ancestor, so I don't know anything else at this point. So always, 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 the first place I'm going to go with anybody who's dead is to go to find a grave. Now, I'm a genealogist. I don't trust anything. It's just my nature not to trust unless I can find evidence that supports what's going on. So here we have Lawrence Hurdle. It says he's a corporal. And it says that he was born in 1758 in Georgetown, Anne Arundel County, Maryland, and he died in 1848 in the city of Alexandria in Virginia, and he's buried in St. Mary's Catholic Church Cemetery. Well, I'm unable to locate a place called Georgetown in Anne Arundel County. I'm able to find an East Georgetown elementary school, but I don't think that elementary school was there during the Revolutionary War. There is, however, a Georgetown in northeastern Kent County that was laid out in 1736. So this may be someone in Find a Grave not knowing what's going on in regards to Georgetown. There may be a Georgetown in Anne Arundel, but I do know that there's a Georgetown in northeast Kent County, which is not far from there. Now, because I'm always going to also research the cemetery that they're in. When did it start? What's going on? Is there any information that will be useful to me? Well, he's buried in St. Mary's in Alexandria, and they have a web page. And believe it or not, they have a page on Lawrence Hurdle as a upstanding member of their congregation, which was founded in 1795 after the war. Uh, Unfortunately, there are things in their history that we will learn actually aren't correct. So again, there is a trust issue, and none of it is cited. So without a citation, it really doesn't mean anything. Uh, so the next person we're going to look for is the wife. Usually, Find a Grave will put those two people together, not always. So here we find Anne, also called Nancy Wheeler. Uh, don't know when she was born, but she was born in Georgetown, Kent County, Maryland. So this gives me some clue that I really don't have to go down the Anne Arundel rabbit hole. She dies in 1863 in Alexandria, and she also is buried in St. Mary's Catholic Cemetery. She doesn't have her own webpage, but Lawrence does. Now, the other thing that you're going to get from Find a Grave is a list of children, maybe a list of siblings, maybe a list of parents. And you'll just want to, again, take it with a grain of salt. But there it is. And these would maybe at least some of the children, maybe all of the children aren't there. So after I've done that, I now have a handle on, given that this is the person that I think I should be researching, I now have a handle on years, places, those kind of things. So I'm going to go and find the census records. And I'm generally going to start with 1850 and work my way back because that's how we do research. We work backwards, we don't work forwards. I'm not going to start with the revolution and get to 1900. I'm going to work my way back through the family, 1900, 1880, 70, 60, 50. Generally, 50 is where you can start. Most Revolutionary War soldiers are dead by 1850. There are quite a number, um, especially those that were very young. And in fact, there's a book called uh, a book on underage, 700 underage or 600 underage Revolutionary War soldiers, based on pensions they basically didn't get because everybody thought they were too young. Um, it's called Underage Warriors. And so go to 1850, go to 1840. And when I go to 1850, I find Nancy in a household in Alexandria in the household of Levi Hurdle, which is one of her sons. I also see an Anne Hurdle there, who's older, and is probably a sister of Levi because they're both in their 40s. Uh, and the Levi that's highlighted is the 14-year-old Levi, not the individual, not the son of Lawrence. He's the grandson of Lawrence. If you go back to the 1840 census, working back, looking either for Lawrence or looking for Levi, you find that there is a Lawrence Hurdle who is the head of household in 1840, and he is in fact 81 years old because there was a column in the 1840 census for Revolutionary War soldiers. And there's his name is, he's 81. Many times you'll find them in a son's household or someone else's household. But in this case, he's in his own household. And you have to remember that the 1840 census is 2 pages. You need to look at 2 pages, not just one, like any other census prior to that. Now, the 1840 census has been published as a census of pensioners. So when we look, we see that in Alexandria City, in the District of Columbia, Alexandria in 1840 is part of Washington, D.C. It's not part of Virginia yet. It becomes part of Virginia in, I think, 1846. But originally, Washington, D.C. is 10 miles square and it extends below the Potomac River. And Alexandria is a part of that, and Arlington is a part of that. And then, of course, it changes. And in 1846, it all goes back to Virginia. So he's living in Alexandria City, which is part of the District of Columbia. And he's in his own, he's the pensioner and he's the head of household. Now, if we were to look at Prince George's County, these are the individuals living in Prince George's County in 1840. There's Martha Wall, and she's 78, so you can assume that she's the widow of a Revolutionary War soldier. But there is James Evans in the 5th Division, and he's 56. There's no way a 56-year-old in 1840 can be a Revolutionary War soldier. So James Evans is probably an invalid War of 1812 soldier. So just remember that these people have to be at least 80 years old in this time frame, uh, or excuse me, 70 years old in this time frame, in order to fit the 1840. And if they're 70, they were very young during the Revolution. So what answers do we have so far? So we've got his name. We know he was 81 in 1840. That means he was born about 1759. We believe now that he's born in Georgetown, Kent County, Maryland. His wife was buried in Georgetown, Kent County, Maryland. And we know that after the conflict, he lived in Alexandria, District of Columbia, but today it would be Alexandria, Virginia. Um, and that his spouse's name is Nancy Wheeler. And we know he has Revolutionary War service based on the 1840 census. So the next thing I'm going to do is go to dar.org. Now, dar.org is one of those probably 5 places that no matter what, I'm going to check all my ancestors, regardless of how old they are. Maybe not in the ancestor search, because I'm not looking necessarily for that the individual I'm searching for has Revolutionary War service, but that they connect to a Revolutionary War soldier. So I'm going to be using the descendants search. And I've been very successful in just plugging people whose parents I didn't know that were like in the 1850 census or 1860 census, just plugging them into the descendant search of dar.org and taking them back to 1739, adding surnames and adding Revolutionary War soldiers. Again, uh, you have to take that information and then prove it, but I'm always on the hunt for clues, and dar.org is an excellent place for clues. So let's look at the clues that they're going to give us about Lawrence. We see he has service in Maryland. He's a private, born 1758. That's within the range of circa 1759 in Maryland. He dies in 1848 in Alexandria, uh, Alexandria County, Virginia. But we know that that actually is the District of Columbia. Uh, so this explains why he's not on the 1850 census, and his wife is there in 1850 with Levi. The S asterisk W means that this means he has a pension. The S stands for survivor. The W stands for widow. That means both of them have pensions. But notice it's only one number. This lets you know that in a single pension envelope, there may be more than one pension. There may be numerous pensions. If there's an S, there still could be more than one pension because it could have been rejected initially. So S means survivor. And the reason it doesn't mean soldier is because some women get pensions. Joyce Callahan from South Carolina is an example. Molly Pitcher, or whatever her real name was, is an example. Um, Now it tells us that he has bounty land. And the coolest part of researching Lawrence is he is certificate number one, the first bounty land certificate for 60 acres under the Act of 1855. And I'll talk about bounty land later, but it's just so cool that I came across this guy and he's number one. I also see service in Captain John Quartz Jones. Quartz has multiple spellings we'll learn over time. And Colonel John Gunby's 7th Regiment. And that normally, when it just says 7th Regiment, that means that it is the State Continental Line Regiment. So we're going to assume, at this point anyway, that it's the 7th Maryland Continental Line Regiment. And he's residing in Montgomery County, Maryland. Now, remember that Montgomery County is named after Richard Montgomery, who died at the Battle of Quebec during the Revolutionary War. So you have to know that Montgomery County was initially Frederick County. And Frederick County was initially Prince George's County, but that was much earlier. And here's his wife, Nancy Wheeler. So everything fits. This is the right person. You always want to make sure that you're dealing with the right person. Everything doesn't have to fit, but there should be a preponderance of fitness. So we have two people who've actually joined the DAR under Lawrence's service, and they both descend from Mary Serena Hurdle, who married James R. Monroe. And when I go and look at the descendants search for these two, their name restricted because of privacy, but that doesn't mean anything because by clicking on the red squares, you can get to genealogies and lineages that will take you back far enough so that you know what you're doing. Now, sometimes because someone has given a gun or forage or beef or something, it could be a very old person. So you may have seven generations, eight generations, nine generations, whereas the smallest generational thing I've ever found was three generations. I knew a person who lived in Mount Rainier in Prince George's County, of course, whose great grandfather, great great grandfather was a Revolutionary War soldier. She was only three generations removed from him. And it turned out he married at a very old age. And then his youngest son married at a very old age. And then his youngest son married at a very old age. And then she was um, I think the youngest daughter. I don't remember exactly. I haven't searched out her lineage. I actually was going to use her for this, and I was going to track her down. I knew she was deceased, so I went looking for her daughter, who years ago I used to date, and I missed her by 5 years. So I've got to figure out where that lineage actually is. So let's look at the children that we've identified and find a grave because we've only identified one child in the DAR, one child in the DAR, Serena, and we've identified two children in the 1850 census, Levi and Anne, Nancy Hurdle. So, and then of course the mother is in the 1850 census. But these are the children according to Find a Grave and recognize that they match the children in DAR, but not all the children are in DAR because people haven't applied to join the DAR. That's the only way that things end up in dar.org. And actually, if there's an error in dar.org, the only way it can be changed is with a new application. You can't go in and say, well, that's wrong. We can, it won't do you any good. The only way that the DAR changes things is with new applications. So now what do we know? We know born 1758, 59, died 1848, lived in Montgomery County, Maryland, lived in Alexandria, survivor pension, widow pension, service, Nancy Wheeler. So in Maryland, we're very lucky. We have buku books on the militia in Maryland and actually the Continental Line too. So the first book I always look at whenever I'm doing Maryland Revolutionary War research is The Maryland Militia in the Revolutionary War by Eugene Clements and F. Edward Wright, and I find him in Montgomery County. So I go pull the Revolutionary Patriots of Montgomery County book by Hank Peden, and all the counties that were extant during the Revolution have been done. So that means Allegheny and Garrett aren't there, but you do find it goes as far west as Washington County, which Allegheny and Garrett would be taken out of later. And there is verbiage here about Lawrence Hurdle, 1758, 1848, all kinds of things from that he was in the District of Frederick, now Montgomery County, that he was in the militia, that he was in the 7th Maryland Line, that he took the oath of allegiance, that his wife's name is Nancy, and that he applied for a pension in Montgomery County, but then she applied for a pension in Alexandria. And there's all kinds of references in here. And then there's three surviving children, Levi, Thomas, and Anne. Well, the Levi and Anne match what we already know in the 1850 census. So, and then it talks about other children and all that kind of stuff and where they married. And so all good stuff. Uh, and then there's a mention of somebody called Noble Lawrence, who is not identified what his relationship to everybody is. So what I then would do would be extract all of the information, references, like you do in Wikipedia. You don't trust what it says in Wikipedia, but you look at the references. That's the cool thing about Wikipedia is the references. That's the cool thing about Peden's books is they're full of references. Now, sometimes those references on some occasions are circular. In other words, one of the references that's here is Clement's book. So this refers to Clement's book kind of thing, but some books refer back and forth. So you don't actually see what the real um, citation might be. It doesn't happen very often, but you have to watch for it. So this is the list of sources that are in that entry. So there's 2 pages of Archives of Maryland, volume uh, 18. The Clements, Maryland Militia is there, page 200. Hodges' Unpublished Revolutionary War Records of Maryland. There's 2 pages. Betty Carruthers, 9,000 Men Who Took the Oath of Allegiance. I didn't use that, but I used a different Betty Carruthers Oath of Allegiance book that got there. And then Virgil White's Genealogical Abstracts of Revolutionary Pension Files, I'm going to ignore. And the reason I'm going to ignore it is because eventually we're going to look at the actual pension. So I don't need Virgil White. 30 years ago, I would have needed Virgil White. Without Fold 3, Virgil White was our go-to. But Virgil White used the select records, not the total records. 2 different sets of microfilm. So it didn't have all the information. It would have told me it was in the Maryland line, but wouldn't have mentioned the 7th. And I need to get to the 7th. So I'm going to start with the Archives of Maryland. And basically, this volume is actually Muster Rolls of Maryland Troops in the American Revolution. It's been published by Southern Historical Press. It's been published by Genealogical Publishing Company. And page 42 puts him in Captain Burgess Company Militia in the lower district of Frederick County, which now is Montgomery. And he's a private. And then page 216 says he's in the 7th Maryland Regiment from 1778 to 1780, and that he's there. But there are additional entries in that book that Peden does not mention in his book on Montgomery County. And remember that we learned that he served to 1780. But on page 390, it says in July of 1781, he's in Captain Beatty's company under command of Lieutenant W. Lamar in the 1st Maryland Regiment. He's part of Smallwood's staff. And then the rest are pay due. And it shows that he's a private of the Maryland line from 1782 to 1783. So recognize that there are lots of pieces that you can put together. Now, when you look at the Revolutionary War records of Maryland by Hodges, you'll find that on page 39 is Lawrence, where he's taking the oath in the worshipful Joseph Wilson's returns in 1778. He's taking the oath of affirmation of fidelity and support of the state. Then another book that's not mentioned in what Peden said is Peden's book on Maryland Public Service Records. This is where you would look for the guys who gave a gun, gave a horse, gave beef, gave forage, gave oats, gave whatever. And basically, they would give this stuff, they'd get a receipt for it, and then after the war, they would file a claim with the state to be reimbursed, but nothing is found there. You always want to look in the public service records, especially if you can't find military service for someone, because being able to find somebody in the military service records and using this as a finding aid to get to the original records will get you into the DAR, for example, because it's public service. So there is a thing out on Fold 3 called Maryland Revolutionary War Records. And when we plug in Lawrence Hurdle, We find stuff that we pretty much already have a good idea about, um, except that it says 1792 Montgomery County, Maryland marriage place when it looks like he actually was married in DC, according to Peden. I actually do not use this because none of this is cited. And for me, anything that's not cited, I don't know where it came from, so I have a trust issue with it. Um, but it's there. It just recognize that without the citations that go with it, it doesn't really mean anything in the long run. Now, he was in the 7th Maryland Regiment. That's a Continental Line regiment. So there is a book called The Continental Army by Robert K. Wright Jr. He used to be the military, he used to work at Fort McNair and was a military historian. I mean, full-time military historian with the Army. He is the historian for the 116th Regiment, National Guard, Virginia National Guard. I call him once a year just to keep in touch with him. Um, he came to Loudoun County once when I was living there, and we had dinner. It was a great time. So when you look inside his book, which you can download from the Center for Military History, you find that the 7th Maryland Regiment was authorized in 1776, and then it was assigned to the main army, and that it consisted of 8 companies from Frederick and Baltimore counties, and then it was assigned to the 1st Maryland Brigade, and then it was reorganized in 79 for 9 companies, uh, and then assigned to the Southern Department, uh, which means that they were involved in the New Jersey engagements, the defense of Philadelphia, Philadelphia and the Battle of Monmouth, and then the defense of the Carolinas. That would mean Camden, Cowpens, Guilford, that kind of thing. So um, the next thing that we're going to talk about, because we now know what units he was in, we want to verify those units in his pension. Now, not everybody has a pension. Not everybody has a compiled military service record. So we may have to go at this point, and if we can't find a pension, go look for compiled military service records. I recommend that you always go for the pension first because the pension contains genealogical information, whereas the compiled military service record, which we'll talk about later, doesn't have any genealogy information in it except maybe a location. So there is a pension law compendium published by Christine Rose. For those of you who have her book on bounty land, which military bounty land, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, it's an appendix in that book also. And this provides portions of the laws relating to the Revolutionary War pensions. In order for somebody to get a pension, there has to be enabling legislation. So there were invalid pensions prior to 1818. And then in 1818, there was a Continental Line pension for people who served through the war in the Continental Line or had 3 years. And then in 1820, there is a law that says all you people who said you were indigent under that 1818 law, we don't believe you. You got to prove that you're indigent. So, in fact, Lawrence Hurtle will prove in 1820 that he's indigent, and I'll show you how he does that. Generally, what you would do is go into court with your inventory of assets. And so in local county courts in 1820, you will see lots of inventories. And you might be confused. You would think the guy might have died and that this is his inventory following his death. It's not. It's his inventory so he can prove to the Secretary of War in 1820 that he's poor enough that he should continue to get his pension. Now, you will find publications like one in Kentucky that says pensioners struck off the roll. And that doesn't mean they did anything wrong. They just had too much money or they had land or something, so they weren't able to qualify as being indigent. Now, indigent existed in the 1818 law, but in 1820, indigent was defined as whatever the Secretary of War determines indigent is. So there's a little bit of fraud associated with that because the, Secretary of War could decide whether you got your pension or not. In 1832, the government decided that most of the militiamen had been kicking up a fuss because they weren't getting pensions, were now dead, so we can provide pensions to militiamen who served at least 6 months. So you got a lot of guys with 5.5 months who try to apply to get a pension. They can't prove 6 months, so they're rejected. Doesn't mean they didn't have service, just means they didn't have 6 months provable service. In 1836, widows who were married prior to the expiration of the soldier's military service were eligible for pensions if their husband, of course, was deceased, if they were widows. And over time, all the way up to 1855, that would continue, and the marriage date would move from 1790 to 1800. And in 1855, the marriage date was removed. So a lot of very old men ended up with very young wives, comparatively speaking, because a man who had $8 cash every month was rich by any measure. So in 1855, also, it was determined that if you would have been if your husband would have lived long enough and you were eligible for a pension, or for some reason you weren't eligible before, but otherwise you qualify now, in 1855, a lot of widows are getting pensions because they may have gotten a half pay pension uh, that had run out. So now they could go ahead and get another pension. This happens more with 1812 people, widows, than it does with the Revolutionary War because it's 1855. But there are a few Revolutionary War widows who are getting um, pensions under the Act of 1855. So those pensions are all on Fold 3. Now, by all on, I mean those pensions that are on the microfilm that deals with the Revolutionary War pensions are on Fold 3. There are other pensions. In 1838, there is a pension that says if your father or whatever died in the Revolutionary War, you can get a one-time payment. Well, that's like a pension. And those are found in statutes at large, which I'll talk about later. So here is the pension for Lawrence Hurdle, or Hurdell, wife Nancy, and you can see that there's W2157. So we know that the widow got a pension. If she didn't, it would be an R. The pension number carries through the family. The prefix is the last thing that was done. So the widow got a pension. We know that based on the DAR information, that Lawrence also got a pension. Now, because there's two spellings of his name, there also out there is a reference card that refers you back to that pension envelope. Notice that the pension number is the same. Notice on the pension envelope, it also has that bounty land warrant of 16055 and that he served for Maryland. So it's possible to have more than one pension in an envelope. This is a case where we have them. You want to separate them apart so that you have the survivor pension in one pile, the widow's pension in another pile. Then you want to put them in chronological order. Then you want to transcribe them probably, because if you're just reading them, you may pass over stuff that is important that you don't realize it's important unless you actually type it. Now, there are some websites that have already done that for you, but they're not necessarily complete and don't cover everything that's in the pension. Maryland pensions are in the Southern campaign because Maryland regiments were in the Carolinas. But you want to separate the people, put them in chronological order. The actual pension envelope for Lawrence is this piece of paper right here. And in the beginning, this was a trifold that held all the information relating to his pension. One of the pieces of paper in that pension is the Secretary of War saying, yeah, you're indigent. You are entitled to continue to get pensions under the Act of 1820. So there is that. You'll also find that generally there will be a mark or a signature in the affidavits, and this is an affidavit from him that talks about his service. Here we find that he was wounded in action at the Battle of Camden in South Carolina. This is when Bannister Tarleton massacres a whole bunch of people. The Baron de Kalb dies 3 days after the battle, after being captured, and that basically they get out of Dodge and they never catch up with Horatio Gates until they get to Hillsborough. Horatio Gates, the commanding general, basically runs off the field. Now, every pensioner who applied for a pension and actually got one would get a pension certificate. And this certificate is what you would present to the pension agent to get your pension, or you would take it to the county courthouse and they would transcribe it. It would be endorsed by the clerk of court, and then the person that you provided a power of attorney to would take it to the pension agency uh, and come back with the money and a receipt, and then the government would keep a receipt. You would move through from pension agencies. Uh, Here is an application for transfer that's in his pension. And then here is the War Department approving that application for transfer. So you will find people do, in fact, move. Now, there are no Bible records in Lawrence's pension, but this is a pension. This is a Bible record of my ancestor William Brockett, who is a major in the South Carolina State Troops. And originally in the pension microfilm, these are photostats. And they fold three when they put them in the pension, reverse the photostats so it would be normal. And unfortunately, I prefer the photostats. Now, one might question why there are photostats in Revolutionary War pensions from 1818. And there are no photostatic machines in 1818. But in the 1880s, the War Department returned the Bible records to someone in the family. And I found the records of the addresses of the people that they returned the Bible records to. And before they returned them, they made photostats of them and put them in the Revolutionary War pensions. So that's why there are photostats in Revolutionary War pensions. Now, obviously, this is very difficult to read. On the 2nd of August, 1969, that's the first time I went to the National Archives. I know that because 20 years later, I found a pink slip inside a record I had looked at previously, and that told me that I was there on that day. And I knew that I was looking at that record on that day, not this record. But because I couldn't read this in the photostat any better than we can read it here, they let me touch the original Revolutionary War record. So I've touched two of them in my life, and they didn't help me read any of them, but that won't stop me from touching them at every opportunity. What there is in the file, however, is a letter, and there are no letters in Lawrence's file, but there are letters in many files. There are two kinds of letters. There are letters from the pension office or the pension from Washington, D.C. pension office to the individual who provided a letter in, and you can trust those. They are a roadmap for what you will find in the pension. The letters to the pension office, you can't trust as far as you can throw them. I found one on a individual in Loudoun County, Enoch Furr, where the letter to the pension office said that Enoch Furr came with Lafayette um, to fight in the Revolutionary War. And in fact, Enoch Furr was born in Fauquier County and moved to Loudoun when he was 6 years old, according to his pension. So don't trust the letters to, but you can trust the letters from. You also, because full three is so easy to use if you know how to use it, you can also look and see where else Lawrence Hurtle is found in other people's pensions. So Lawrence Hurtle is found in three pensions: Nehemiah Lowe, Bennett Riley, and Charles Dawkins. And what we're looking for here is, do they have service with Lawrence Hurtle? These three gentlemen don't. They just happen to be Marylanders who he knows that they had Revolutionary War service. So he's providing affidavits for them so that they can prove their service. And if you'll notice, there's a Robert Hurdle there. I haven't researched who Robert Hurdle is. He might be a brother of Lawrence. I don't know because I haven't researched him, but definitely as part of my research plan would be to find out who Robert Hurdle was. He's probably a brother of Lawrence, but I don't know that. So what did we learn? Active 1818, Continental Line, 7th Maryland, wounded at Camden, moved to Alexandria to be near his children, and that he's mentioned the pension file three other pensioners, but none of them served with him. So let's look at the widow's pension. So this is what the actual widow's pension is. And she says in her pension that she married him on the 20th day of October between the years 1790 and 1793 inclusive. I don't know. I think I remember what year I got married if I only had one wife. Um, it turns out in looking at Montgomery County marriages, um, I, I think they were married in 1792. But anyway, and that he died on the first day of December in 1848. So that's all good information. We also have an affidavit that says that um, she is who she says she is. In other words, proof of identity, signed by Levi Hurdle and his, probably that's Lydia, his wife. And in the 1850 census, we see Lydia is his wife. And then we see that she transfers from Richmond to the District of Columbia because Richmond is 100 miles away in the District of Columbia she lives in, but not in 1855 because remember it becomes Alexandria, Virginia in 1846. So because she's in Virginia, she thinks she has to go to Richmond. She doesn't. She can move and do it at the District of Columbia, which is just across the river. Enoch Furr also moved his pension from Richmond to the District of Columbia because he lived in Loudoun County and it wasn't 100 miles away to get to DC. It was like 50. So what do we learn? We get a marriage date, we get a maiden name and that it was her first marriage, and we get some children named. And we also learned that he has service in Frederick, the lower district of Frederick, which became Montgomery County, and that he's in the 7th Maryland line, still very consistent. We know he was a private in both the militia and the Continental Line. So we know he's not an officer. Don't forget, Find a Grave says he's a corporal. It's likely that that corporal is an honorific applied to him after the war. Sometimes you find people are all of a sudden named captain, and you can't find any captain proof of service. He also could have stayed in the Maryland militia after the war, and because of his Revolutionary War service, got promoted to corporal. I don't know any of those things, but we just know that in the Revolutionary War, he doesn't tell us that he's a corporal. He tells us that he's a private. We also have the names of captains, and we name and the name of a colonel. We know that based on his service, although he doesn't mention it, he's at Harlem Heights in New York, and then he's at Camden, South Carolina, and then he's at Yorktown. But he's not at Yorktown with the 7th. Everybody in Virginia was at Yorktown. That's why the mountains are so high in the West. The weight of all those people in Yorktown forced those mountains at least a foot or two higher. He's a survivor. There's no mention of being a prisoner. And we do know his marriage is 20 October. And we know from the pension that his father is Leonard. So Gunby is actually the son of a loyalist. And he is basically responsible at the Battle of Camden for saving what's left of the Maryland line after the battle. And Horatio Gates, the general, he basically just runs away. And 2/5 of the Marylanders were killed and wounded, including General DeKalb, who was mortally wounded. And prior to his death, DeKalb provided a glowing tribute to the Maryland troops under his command. There's a really good book on the Baron de Kalb written by John Peakes that's available now that is just really excellent and uh, gives us good insight into who General de Kalb was. John Quartz Jones, sometimes counts, but it's actually Quartz, um, lived until 1802. He was from Charles County, Maryland. He was a planner who began the revolution as a second lieutenant in the flying camp. That's the militia who moved into Pennsylvania, moved into New Jersey. Uh, they moved out of the flying camp, moved out of Maryland. He entered the war as a captain and served as an aide de camp to Major General Smallwood. It may be that that's why Lawrence Hurtle was part of William Smallwood's staff because Jones may have taken him with him when he moved up to Smallwood's staff. He also served in the lower house from Charles County in 1785 and as a naval officer and he also was the naval officer and was an original member of the Society of Cincinnati. Whenever you've got a Maryland officer, you want to look to the Society of Cincinnati to see what they can tell you about them. Um, so anyway, since we now know his service specifically as the 7th Maryland Regiment and then the militia unit, we can look and find the service. We're not going to find the militia. We might, but in this case we don't. And now we're going to find the compiled military service records. And we know that this is our Lawrence Hurtle because he's the only Lawrence Hurtle in the 7th Maryland Regiment. Now, the numbers that you see on this envelope refer to the cards that are in the envelope. And they have no meaning except each card has its own serial number stamped on the back of the card. So basically, we have a card for payrolls and muster rolls, June, July, August, September, 1788, 1777. I was unable to find any um, compiled military service record for his time with General Smallwood. You may find that here's another one from a guy in the Virginia Regiment. And what it says is that he's at Valley Forge. So you may be able to find that kind of thing going on. I always love to see abstract cards that say at Valley Forge. Here is a certificate of balance of pay for him for reenlisting in the 7th in 1779. So basically, he's getting finally paid. So what do we learn by looking at his compiled military service records? We learned that he was in the hospital in September 1778. We can't find any that he was furloughed because he was sick. He reenlisted, and we always want to compare what's in the compiled military service record to the pension. Now, fortunately, Fold 3 has the Revolutionary War rolls available there also. And so we can see him in the 7th. There are 4 muster rolls that have his name on them. And the good thing about a muster roll, especially early in the war, is that you can use it to identify neighborhoods because men are joining together. So you may look at a muster roll for an individual that doesn't have a pension, then easily determine somebody in that company that does have a pension because you have their names and you can just search them in Fold 3. And then based on reading that individual's affidavit, you'll have some idea about what was going on. So basically, these individuals who have pensions are always going to describe their time at the Battle of Camden because they were survivors of Camden. Camden was not a good time. Now, whenever you've got a pension, you're also going to have last or final payment vouchers, and the index to these are on Fold 3. And you get to those by name, by state, by name. Now, this is not state of service. This is state of where they're living at the time that they're getting their pension. So here is Lawrence Hurtle. He has an asterisk, and that means that they actually have his final payment on file in the National Archive in the collection of final payments. which unfortunately are not accessible right now because they're digitizing all of them. So eventually, I would assume that once they've been digitized, they will end up on Fold 3. He's being paid at DC under the Act of 1838, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. And here he's date of payment is fourth quarter 1848, and but he dies 1st of September 1848. Well, that is the fourth quarter. So it's likely that in looking at this, that he's being paid under the Act of 1838, his heirs are being paid, um, and that uh, they're coming in after he has died and collecting his payment from his last payment until the time of his death. So last payments are the last time that a pension office pays a pensioner. Could be the pensioner moves, could be the pensioner died and no one picked up a final payment, or it could be the pensioner just doesn't need the hassle anymore for $8 a month. I can't imagine that happening, but it does. Final payments are payments made to heirs from the date of last payment to the date of death. So you always want to hope for a final payment. It may be decades after the death of a pensioner, but none of them are happening after 1867 because the law changes in 1867. These are all found in Record Group 217, the records of the accounting officers, entry number 722, and you can just order them by name. Now, Georgia and Delaware are on Fold 3 already because the Delaware and Georgia Genealogical Societies paid to have those records microfilmed. So if you've got a Delaware or Georgia guy that you're interested in, you're in good shape. So again, these last or final payments, they show up in trifold sized envelopes, and you'll find affidavits. Generally, this is the original record for so far as the government is concerned in regards to what the date of death is. And then you may find other affidavits and you'll find the payment, the final payment. This is the receipt for the final payment. Now, some states like Maryland have been abstracted by Allison Pierce or by um, Kay Gunning. Gunning did Rhode Island, Pennsylvania. Pierce did the rest. They're published. Some are published by Heritage Books. Some are published by Iberian. But if we look at what's said about Lawrence in Maryland, or rather in the District of Columbia, it says Lawrence Hurdle, 1838, final fourth quarter, 1848, 1 December 1848. That's stuff that's on the card. Alexandria, Virginia, 4 March 1848, Lawrence Hurdle, X's Mark, former Pride and Revolution, resident here for 15 years, and previous thereto, Maryland appoints Levi Hurdle attorney, that's his son, to collect pension due from 4 September 47 to 4 March 48, sworn before Lucian Payton, JP signature, witnesses W. Kelly signature, and J. Fletcher. DC 4 March 48, he collected $48. So the reason that, and actually the next entry after that is Robert Hurdle's wife, Susan. Just remember Robert from what we saw previously. So anyway, so those are the final payments, last and final payments. And then there are pension ledgers. And these are found on Ancestry. They cover 1818 to 1872, the ones that I'm talking about. And when we look at Lawrence Hurdle, we see both he and Nancy. So when we blow that up a little bit, the matrix of these, so we want to look at pretty much all of these. So he's living in Maryland, then he moves to the District of Columbia, and then Nancy goes to Richmond. And for some reason, which I'm unable to totally fathom, she goes to the other pension office in Virginia at the time, Wheeling, which is now West Virginia, of course. And then I guess that didn't work out for her because she ends up back in the District of Columbia. Now, that either one day I may pull the actual pension voucher to see if actually that it's Wheeling and not Richmond, and that some clerk in DC made a mistake and just wrote it down in the wrong ledger. which is possible. But this is what the ledger looks like, and it is ugly, is the best thing that I can say about it. But it's full of March and September is when you could go to a pension agency and get your money. Uh, Pension agencies were not in government buildings. They were not in the post office. They were in banks because banks have vaults. And all the pension agents pretty much were bankers. And usually somebody who wasn't a banker that was a pension agent did not last very long because they didn't have a vault and they had to rely on a bank for a vault. So it didn't work out very well. So pension agents tend to be bankers. You always want to look at the tails to see what they say. They can tell you about transfer. They can talk about death. They can talk about something called 6 April 1838. And here is Lawrence Huddle, District of Columbia. And you can see the ones and the threes. He's pretty religious because that's when he's eligible. March is first quarter, September is third quarter. He's pretty religious about getting his pension on time. Now you see over a little bit in the center of those, you'll see what looks like two tick marks above. He missed that. Notice it says 1-1. He missed that third quarter, so he picked it up in the first quarter of the next year. That's what that means. That actually isn't a 1-1. It's a 65 is what it actually is. Because in the first quarter of 65, he picked up the September payment. Now there is an index, as I said, the index, and remember I talked about the asterisk. Well, some of them don't have asterisks. So where do you look? Because they're not in 722, entry 722 of record group 217. They have to be somewhere else. Well, they happen to be two-thirds of them anyway, based on Allison Pierce and my research about Virginians. Two-thirds of the missing Virginians with no asterisk were found in the settled accounts of 6 April 1838. And 1838 is an act, 6 April 1838 is an act that basically said the government's tired of money laying around pension agencies. If you haven't picked up your pension payment in 8 months, you have to come to DC to get it, to the Treasury. So this is actually, remember that Lawrence hadn't picked up his money at the very end for a number of months. So he had to go to DC to get it. And that's why it said 1838 on his card. So this is what one looks like. There was not one in his file, but this is one for the wife of William Wall, who was originally in the Baltimore agency. He's a Prince George's guy. So if you see this in the pension record, this form, you will know that there is something under the Act of 6 April 1838 in entry 724. So I thought that was so cool that I created a finding aid to those records in 724. It's called the Lost Pensions Settled Accounts of the Act of 6 April 1838. It's a revised edition because 3 months after I put out the first edition, they flat filed all the records. And not being an archivist, I didn't realize that the box number means nothing. So the revised edition basically has the year instead of the box. So no matter what box they put them in, you can now get to them. There is a crosswalk if you have the older edition that crosswalks the boxes into the years. And so this is one Lawrence Hurdle, widow of 1850, is picking up that payment. Now, notice that Lawrence had his son pick up a payment, but that was before he died. This is her picking up the payment after he died. And then you have to pull these out by pension office, year or box number, and account number, years preferred. Now, there's really not enough. I could spend an entire hour talking about pension ledgers. Instead of doing that, I recommend that you obtain a copy of, if you don't follow this very well, and it's difficult to follow. I wrote a book on understanding Revolutionary War and invalid pension registers that deals with Revolutionary War soldiers, widows, and then invalid pensioners of the War of 1812, and then their payment vouchers. And if you've never seen a photograph of a Revolutionary War soldier, this is Daniel Waldo, who lives until 1867. And I have a friend, David Lambert, up in Boston at New England Historical Genealogical Society, who has 6 carts of CARTE of Waldo. And I think I've almost got him ready to sell me one, but I'm close, but I'm not there yet. Uh, in the 1860s, Hildreth wandered around the country photographing Revolutionary War soldiers. And he did a book, and each book actually was an individual book of actual photographs done in 1867 that were basically surrounded by cardboard. And a friend of mine, a bookseller, had one, and he was giving me the family discount at $300 for the book. And I have kicked myself ever since for not taking him up on it. I wish I had. I would have loved to have owned a copy of Soldiers of Men of the Revolution, is what it was called. So we're going to talk about pensions for the state now. We've talked about federal pensions. These are state pensions. So there's a book called Westward of Fort Cumberland that, based on the title, you would think it was just bounty land, state bounty land. But it's not. It includes a section on state pensions. And here, um, Lawrence Hurdle got half pay of a sergeant beginning in 1816. Now, this ends in 1818 because the federal government has taken over the responsibility for paying that pension. But there's Lawrence in Mary Meyer's book. Mary Meyer used to be the genealogist at the Maryland Historical Society. And then when you look at you look that he got $60, and then it covers from actually 1816 up to 1822. And then the state realized that he was getting a federal pension too. So it sort of got in the way. So don't forget state pensions. Federal bounty land. This book, Military Bounty Land by Christine Rose, is excellent. It's out of print. I can't convince her to reprint it. It just hurts me that this is the best book on military bounty land. If you could find it, grab it. There also is in the Revolutionary War microfilm on Fold 3, you'll find that there is a card for him dealing with that bounty land 16055. You don't normally see that, but then there's stuff relating to February 1790, and that's why. So he was getting some bounty land in 1790. This probably accounts for why he only has 60 acres under the Act of 1855, because the Act of 1855 is 160 acres. Whenever you find bounty land, total bounty land, that doesn't equal 160 acres at least, you want to look more, because they should have been entitled lifetime entitlement to 160 acres. So you'll find that there are records on ancestry that deal with bounty land that you should peruse. There is a bounty land map available, downloadable. There are multiple bounty land maps. Oh, you can see the corner of Maryland, that's Garrett, Allegheny County. It's Allegheny, and then Garrett gets pulled out of Allegheny later. But that's where the Maryland line got their bounty land. Now, after that, you'll find that under the Act of 1855, Marylanders with service, militia, or Continental Line could get land anywhere in the federal domain. So when we look at what's out on Ancestry, you'll find something for Lawrence Hurdle. And this is one of the problems with Ancestry. Notice Lawrence isn't spelled right. So if you can't find it the first time, just look for the last name. But always deal from the perspective of the card catalog. So you're in a specific series of records instead of doing a general search. And here is his warrant for 100 acres in 1790, which explained I've now found the 160 acres, the 60 that's in the pension, and then the 100 that he got in 1790. So I'm always, for every individual that I have in my family, I'm going to go and look in the federal bounty land. I'm going to do a BLM patent search, regardless of whether they lived in the West or not. Because what you'll find, here's Lawrence. He dies. His wife, Nancy, is taking that land and she's assigning it to Jesse Lang. So you can probably stop there because of the assignment. What I'm looking for when I look here is I'm looking for the same surname or a son-in-law who's getting the land, so the family is keeping the land. That doesn't happen very often, but it does happen. Notice this is in 1860. And when we look at the pieces, we see that it's the Revolutionary War, the 1855 Scrip Warrant Act, document number one, my favorite. It just excites me to know it's document number one. And the total acres are 68.08. That would round to 60 and would be just fine. There also, notice there it says patent image. Here's half the patent image. The patent image is really grand if it's your family getting the land, but when it's assigned to somebody else, it's not as much fun. So Revolutionary War state bounty land was set aside as a tool for creating state support for the war. Bounty land was not federally promised until 1792 when everybody claimed Ohio. So this was how the government got everybody to let loose of Ohio so the Northwest Territory could be the Northwest Territory. So there is no state bounty land from some states. Ancestry has a book called Revolutionary Bounty Land Grants. Lawrence Hurdle is in there with another 50 acres. Don't forget the Maryland bounty land. I haven't talked about Blacks and Indigenous. There are records, and I'm sure they'll be talked about in the next session, but there are also Black and Indigenous soldiers in the American Revolution out on full three. So other sources are Revolutionary War state pensions. You will find there are also abstracts of graves done by the DAR. Always check everybody in your ancestry and statutes at large. And don't forget the Maryland State Library for other sources relating to the revolution. Let me skip through some things real quick that I just talked about. Another resource is a pictorial field book of the revolution. And I have 5 series out on legacy. I have just genealogy with 370. My email is there. It's on the handout. If you have questions we can't get to tonight, please contact me. I'll be happy to help you. And don't forget my YouTube channel, which I've actually spent a lot of time on. And I'm done. Sorry this took so long. I talked as fast as I could. But
Well,
anyway.
I'm very pleased to have learned as much as I did about Mr. Hurdle, and which was really remarkable. All the ins and outs and pathways there. I have kept track of the specific questions from the chat, and there's been some good discussion. So feel free, folks, to